In Washington, D.C. in 1965, Bernard is told to be careful because they want to make an example out of him. He then gets ready to testify before a committee. His story begins in Texas in 1939. Child Bernard works as a shoe shiner outside a bank, so he hears all the customers' conversations about finances and real estate investing. Once his customers leave, he writes down everything on his notebook. One day he stands by the window to learn more stuff from a bank meeting. However, a cop sees him and pulls him down. A chase ensues and Bernard manages to escape, but the cop swears his father will hear about it. That night, Bernard's dad scolds him for spying on white people, explaining how black men have been hanged for less. He sees the notebook and admits that Bernard is very smart, but also warns him that white men will never let him make money. However, Bernard is stubborn and swears he'll be rich one day. In Los Angeles in 1954, an older Bernard is married to Eunice and they have a son. Today they're visiting Eunice's family and her uncle shares that an aircraft company is hiring black men. Bernard turns down the offer, saying he's trying to make money through real estate. His plan is to own a property and earn money through rent. Since the family is currently renting a small shed that belongs to the uncle, the man gets angry and accuses Bernard of not wanting to work. After dinner, Eunice tells her uncle that Bernard is a genius and that things will be solved soon. Then she joins her husband in the shed, and Bernard promises he'll get them out of there as soon as possible. The next day, Bernard takes Eunice's cousin Tony to work. Tony's friend Matt admires Bernard's car and thinks he's rich, so Tony tells him that Bernard owns buildings. Afterward, Bernard visits a bunch of buildings in a white neighborhood, making sure to check what state they're in and their prices. Later, Bernard tells Eunice that he's found the perfect building, but buying it would leave them with no money for renovations. Thinking they need a co-investor, Eunice decides to introduce Bernard to Joe, the man she used to work for before she got married. Joe is very laid back and jokes about everything, so Bernard can't take him seriously and refuses to work with him. The couple leaves without sharing their business idea, and on their way out, they see the governor coming to visit Joe because they're friends. This is still not enough to change Bernard's mind. Sometime later, Bernard meets with Patrick, the owner of the house he wants to buy. Bernard asks him to loan him $10,000 for renovations if he buys the house, but Patrick refuses and explains why by using some calculations. His math has mistakes and Bernard immediately corrects them. This impresses Patrick, but he still won't loan him the money. Before leaving, Bernard notices a calendar sent by Reed from Mid-City Bank. Then Bernard goes to that bank and asks for Reed. The secretary tells him Reed isn't available, although Bernard can see he is, which means he's being kicked out because of his race. Instead, Bernard decides to wait outside the bank. Eventually, Reed leaves work, and Bernard immediately approaches him to tell him about a business idea that would benefit both him and Patrick. That night, Bernard tells Eunice that he didn't get the loan. At that moment, he gets a call from Patrick, who has heard that Bernard used his name to talk to Reed. Patrick asks him if he thinks what he did follows normal business customs, and Bernard answers no. This makes Patrick happy because he likes people who don't follow normal customs like himself, so he announces that Bernard can go to the bank in the morning to get the loan and he'll be his guarantor. Afterward, Eunice and Bernard go to a club to celebrate. Joe approaches Bernard and keeps on teasing him, so Bernard likes him even less. The next day, Bernard and Tony are already working on renovating the property. One of the tenants sees them and calls them out for being in a white neighborhood. Bernard explains he's the new owner, but the old lady doesn't believe him. Moments later, Matt arrives to help, and Bernard asks him if he'd be fine working for a black man. Matt answers that the only color he cares about is money green. The trio spends the day working hard on the renovations. Soon 2 cops arrive saying the old lady complained about the black man working in the building. Bernard shows them the paperwork that proves he's the building owner, and the officers quickly leave. After the renovations are done, Bernard moves to one of the apartments and is seen by the old lady, who moves out the next morning to avoid living next to a black family. Soon, more black people are asking to rent the apartments, and the property is fully leased in just a few days. Patrick is impressed and asks Bernard to be his business partner. Bernard can choose the buildings because he has a good eye, and Patrick will be the face to avoid bigotry. The men shake hands and agree on 50-50. For the next few weeks, the new business duo continues to buy properties and their business blossoms. Matt and Tony help them with the renovations, and Eunice chooses the decorations. One day, Bernard asks Eunice for ideas for a huge house, only to reveal this is their new home. Sometime later, Patrick is found dead in his bed. After the funeral, Patrick's wife announces she wants to end the business and offers Bernard 25% of the money. Bernard calls her out since he's supposed to own 50%, but since his name isn't on any papers, he must take this or nothing. The lawyer tells Bernard that to prove the original arrangement, he'll need a witness. Bernard goes to the bank to see Reed, but he refuses to receive him. On his way out, Bernard looks at a sign that makes him realize how much space the bank needs. He visits Joe and shares his idea they should work together to buy the banker's building. That way, none of the banks that rent space there will be able to refuse to give them loans, which in turn means buying more buildings. Joe likes the idea but thinks nobody will want to sell to black men, so they invite Matt to be the face of the business. Matt is unsure because he knows nothing about this topic and ends up leaving even though the men promise to guide him. Later, Matt goes to a diner and is still nervous about the whole plan. The waitress Susie asks him if he's okay, so he explains he's considering a new job in real estate. Susie is very impressed by this, which makes Matt change his attitude, and he rushes back to the guys to take the job. The first step to train Matt is teaching him how to talk to rich folks. So Joe makes the group go to the golf course at 6 a.m. to learn the game. Soon they're joined by Joe's banker Donald, who will lend $2 million. Bernard assures him they'll get the building for less. Next, Bernard teaches Joe about all the calculations needed for the job, although math isn't Matt's strong suit. For the next few weeks, Matt practices hard to get better at golf and math. He struggles a lot at first, but he gains confidence every day and impresses the others with a hole-in-one, followed by a successful calculation. Now he can get his first suit, Joe teaches him how to drink like a man, and Eunice teaches him all about dining etiquette. When Matt manages to do a calculation in his head while golfing, the men decide he's ready. The next step is to discuss the details of the plan. The banker's building is owned by Charles, who often plays golf at a very exclusive country club. Joe makes some arrangements and manages to get Matt in as a guest. Joe pretends to be his driver to make him look richer than he is. Using his golf skills, Matt manages to impress everyone and successfully organizes a meeting with Charles in his office. Joe and Bernard train him for a week, and when the day comes, Matt is ready to answer all of Charles's questions. He's memorized all the calculations and repeats them by pretending he's doing the math on the spot. In the end, Charles agrees to sell the building for $1,560,000. After the group celebrates, they start to redecorate the office, and their relationship with the bankers grows very quickly. Soon they're getting the need and buying lots of buildings in fancy white neighborhoods. This economic stability allows Matt to marry Susie. In just a few months, the trio becomes the biggest real estate businessman in the state, and they even get to meet the vice president. A few years later, in 1963, Bernard returns to Texas with his family to visit his father. The old man is happy to see him and even tells him how proud he is. The next day, he takes a walk with his son and has to explain why here the fountains are separated. Bernard stops at the corner where he used to work and asks the new shoe shiner to do his shoes, but the man refuses because he's black. Then Bernard stares at the bank where he learned everything and gets an idea. When Bernard returns to Los Angeles, he tells Joe that he wants to buy the bank in Texas. Joe points out they know nothing about running a bank, which is very complex and will be even harder because Texans won't like a black man in charge. Bernard points out they can use Matt again and explains that there's a large untapped market because black people aren't allowed to borrow money. After a long argument, a very reluctant Joe ends up agreeing just not to lose Bernard as a partner, calling it a bad idea. Sometime later, Donald helps Matt buy the Texan bank for Bernard and Joe. As part of the deal, the previous owner and his son Robert will still have a 20% interest. Afterward, Bernard starts visiting all black people in Texas to let them know that the bank has changed policies and now black people are welcome. However, he also asks them to keep it discreet since racist folks won't approve of the bank doing this. All the loans are done through Bernard and Matt, and soon lots of black businesses in the neighborhood are flourishing. After 3 months of this, Robert, who still works at the bank, notices how many loans Matt has been approving, so he wonders where all these new clients suddenly came from. Matt dodges the question, and Robert is so suspicious that he starts following him. He finds him chatting with Bernard and takes pictures. That night when Matt goes home, Susie admits she hates Texas. She also points out that Matt is only getting a salary when supposedly he was promised to be partner. The next day, Robert shows up at Bernard's house while he's having a meeting with Matt and Joe. He tells them he has no issue with working for black people, but he's worried that if the locals find out, their business will sink. Then he shows them the reason for his worries. A letter from the U.S. Treasury Department announcing they'll do an inspection in 1 month because they've received anonymous complaints about the bank making too many unsafe loans. After Robert leaves, Matt takes his friends to look at a smaller bank to share an idea. They could buy this small bank and he can run it himself, then they can do some financial tricks to divide the loans between both banks. That way the numbers will look less suspicious during the inspection. Joe and Bernard point out they still don't have enough experience to do something so dangerous, so Matt announces that he'll stop helping them if he doesn't get to be a partner too. With no other choice, the duo agrees. Soon Matt buys the small bank, and on the first working day, Eunice pretends to be a cleaning lady to keep an eye on things. Meanwhile, Tommy takes Bernard around town so they can decide which loan goes where. That night, they meet at a restaurant with Matt to arrange everything, and they're devastated to see racist graffiti on the sign. The next day, Matt meets with a lawyer to sign all the paperwork. Sometime later, Robert calls Matt to tell him some white people want to withdraw all their money because they think the bank is owned by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That night, Bernard shows Joe a racist sign that he found at the bank. He explains that 5 white people withdrew all their money and 9 were convinced to stay by Robert. Joe thinks it was Robert himself who started the rumors. A few days later, a federal bank examiner comes to the small bank to go through the books, so Matt calls Bernard for help. However, Bernard doesn't know what to do because they'd never allow a black man in the meeting. Eunice tells him to pretend to be a servant, and when he refuses, she reminds him that she did it many times to help them. Bernard says it's different because she's a woman, causing a furious Eunice to compare his dumb logic to what white people say about blacks. Realizing his mistake, Bernard agrees to put on a uniform and pretends to be a cleaning man at the bank. He cleans near the door to Matt's office to make gestures that will help him, but unfortunately the agent closes the door to avoid anyone listening to confidential information. Bernard has no choice but to walk away, and Matt gets nervous as the agent starts finding lots of holes in his story. Pretending he needs a file, Matt rushes to the bathroom to talk to his friends, who give him as much advice as they can. Unfortunately, when Matt returns to the office, the agent has discovered tons of mistakes on the books that he can't justify. Matt rushes back to the bathroom with the files, and Bernard immediately finds the mistakes too. Joe wonders how Donald could have missed that, and Matt has to confess he used a different man to speed up the process. This new lawyer was recommended by Robert, so Joe and Bernard angrily realize that Robert had a plan to ruin them all along. That night, Bernard tells Eunice the final result of the meeting. They have to sell 27 bad loans and cover all the markdowns themselves, which will cost $300,000. Later, Bernard and Joe tell Matt that they won't help him. People like them could get into big trouble if they're caught, and it was Matt's idea to buy this small bank, so it's his responsibility. The next morning, Donald calls Joe to tell him that his bank bought all the loans from Matt's. Soon, Joe and Bernard are angrily bursting into Matt's office to demand an explanation. Matt says this is just temporary so he can have more time to modify more books. However, the duo points out this is fraud. At that moment, agents from the Treasury Department arrive and announce the bank has lost its license. These men fire Matt and order all the clients to leave, explaining the bank is closed until further notice. As soon as Joe and Bernard step outside, the FBI approaches them to arrest them without saying why. Bernard calls out their racism and tries to resist the arrest, but the agents easily overpower him. Sometime later in Washington, D.C., a lawyer tells Joe and Bernard that the state banking charges have been dropped, but that federal charges are still up. There's a senator in Arkansas holding hearings about lax oversights in banks, and the lawyer suspects he's trying to use the case to make a political statement, which could potentially help them get the federal charges dropped too. Meanwhile, Matt is still in trouble with his own bank, so the authorities offer him a deal. His charges will be dropped if he testifies against his friends. A few days later, Matt appears in court to explain all of Joe's and Bernard's plans, saying that he was only their employee and they manipulated him. Then Bernard is given 2 choices. If he says he used some lax rules to enrich himself, which would provide Congress with an argument to change those rules, he gets immunity. If he says whatever he wants, his testimonies will be compared to white people, and if the court decides he's lying, he'll be sent to jail. After the hearing, Bernard goes on a walk with Eunice and shares his worries. If he takes the immunity deal, he won't be able to bring to light all the issues black people have in the banking system. Eunice tells him she'll support him no matter what. Before entering the courtroom, Bernard meets with Joe, and they reminisce about all these years of working together. In the testimony, Bernard says that the country's founding documents declare that all men are created equal, but this isn't the case in the law. Ignoring all the warnings he receives about losing immunity, Bernard stands up with a cleaning uniform in hand and explains that if a man can't get a loan, he can't start a business or buy a home, which goes against the American dream. In the end, the government takes Joe's and Bernard's fortunes and sentences them to 3 years in federal prison. They lose all the buildings too, although Eunice keeps one house because it was under her name. Robert ends up buying the bank back for a very low cost. When the duo finally leaves prison, Eunice doesn't understand why they're laughing. They reveal that Matt talked to them before testifying to explain he would spend 50 years in prison if he didn't betray them. The guys agreed to let him do it, and in exchange, Matt bought 2 houses for them in the Bahamas before the government could take the money. Thanks to Joe's and Bernard's testimonies, in 1968, the Congress passes the Fair Housing Act, which makes it illegal to refuse to sell or rent property on the basis of race, religion, or gender. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe for more awesome movie highlights.